Well, he said, we'll use our customary methods. I said, what are those? Well, he said, we'll hail it. I said, what language will you hail it in? Well, he said, how the hell do I know? He said, I guess we'll hail it in English. He said, well, I suppose you hail it in English and they don't speak English. What are they going to do? He said, well, we'll fire a warning shot across their bow. I said, what if they don't stop then? He said, we'll fire a shot through their rudder. He said, what kind of a vessel is that? He said, it's a tanker. I said, what will happen if you fire a shot through the rudder? Well, he said, it might catch on fire, might miss a little bit, might catch on fire. Well, I said, let me tell you something, George. We're not trying to start a war. We're trying to convey a message, a political message. There'll be no shot fired by anybody. Do you understand that? Is that clear to you? He said, yes, sir. Walked out of the room. Now, that was a rather harsh way of conveying the message that control would remain in the hands of the president.
On the Atlantic, U.S. fighters and reconnaissance planes tracked Soviet ships approaching the blockade line. Anxious to ensure that war would not break out through accident or overzealousness, President Kennedy, a former PT boat skipper, took personal command of the blockade operation.
As push came to shove, President Kennedy had taken over the line to the lead ship, our ships, down at the blockade. He was on the phone, and they were waiting to see what questions he asked and what answers he got. All eyes on him with the one telephone, holding it to his ear and asking the question and getting it described to him by phone by the commander down there. It was as quiet a moment in the Oval Office as anyone has ever seen.
At 10:25 a.m. on October 24th, 12 of the Soviet ships suddenly stopped, dead in the water.
There was a certain note of excitement when he reported, they've stopped. The ships have stopped. Well, they're not turning around yet, but they're dead in the water. The captain reports they're dead in the water. And of course, I can remember that everybody breathed a rather large sigh of relief.
I think one or two ships did stop, but a lot of ships had already passed through. But there was great danger. It was actually a military action, almost a declared war. But we weren't taking any chances. We didn't want to deepen this crisis. We were looking for some compromise. A number of our ships had been ordered back. They changed their routes, but everything was already in Cuba. The missiles were in Cuba, so it was not such a big problem for us.
The blockade stopped the arrival of any reinforcements, but Kennedy could not be sure that the missiles in Cuba were not already armed. In fact, there were 42 missiles and warheads already on the island. The crisis was far from over. The next morning at the United Nations, United States Ambassador Adlai Stevenson displayed the U-2 photographs to the world for the first time. Stevenson confronted Soviet Ambassador Zorin with the evidence.
Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sights in Cuba? Yes or no? Don't wait for the translation, yes or no?
I am not in an American courtroom, sir, and therefore I do not wish to answer a question that is put to me in the fashion in which a prosecutor does. In due course, sir, you will have your reply.
I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over, if that's your decision.
Ambassador Zorin's decision was once again to deny the presence of Soviet offensive missiles in Cuba. But the next afternoon, away from the TV lights, the Soviets made an unorthodox attempt to resolve the crisis. The Soviet KGB chief in Washington urgently requested a lunch with ABC reporter John Scali.
He said, what would you think of a solution of the crisis which would involve first our withdrawing these missiles from Cuba and doing this under United Nations inspection? Do you think that your government would be interested? I said, I was just a reporter and I didn't know, but It sounded to me, I said, like it was something that could be discussed. He then went on to say that, could I check urgently with my high friends in the administration?
While the Soviets were exploring a compromise through unofficial channels, Khrushchev sent Kennedy a teletyped message.
Mr. President, we and you ought not to pull on the ends of the rope in which you have tied the knot of war. Because the more the two of us pull, the tighter that knot will be tied. And a moment may come when that knot will be tied so tight that even he who tied it will not have the strength to untie it.
It was a yards-long teletype, a phenomenal teletype. It was a teletype written by a man under tremendous emotion, as in a sense this paragraph implies. It was clearly written by Khrushchev himself. It expressed his deep, I'll call it deep fears and deep concerns, but fears and concerns, but also determination.
It was distraught and emotional and suggested that maybe the old man was losing his cool. And we didn't like the thought that someone whose finger was on the nuclear trigger was losing his cool.
So we were left with the feeling, and I think we slept on it that night, that there was both danger and hope inherent in that message.
But early next morning, day 12 of the crisis, danger smothered hope. The White House received a second, much tougher message. The Soviets had raised the ante, insisting that they would remove their missiles from Cuba only if the U.S. would halt the blockade, promise never to invade Cuba, and remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. It was signed by Khrushchev.
To remove the missiles from Turkey under Soviet threat was just inconceivable. It would indicate to the Turks a loss of will, a lack of will on the part of the U.S., and they would question the value of our commitment to their defense. So it was inconceivable that we would yield to that threat. And yet, should we go to war over an obsolete weapon that was a pile of junk? There's the great danger that you will try to deal with and solve political problems with military action.
With demonstrators clamoring for a resolution to the crisis, the Soviet position apparently stiffening, and the missiles still in Cuba, the Joint Chiefs of Staff recommended and prepared for military actions. 250,000 troops were moved to U.S. bases in Florida and Georgia and airlifted to Guantanamo Bay. Anti-aircraft missiles were installed on Florida beaches, and Marines practiced amphibious landings on Caribbean islands. In the event of an invasion, the Southern Expeditionary Force would be commanded by Major General William Fairborn.
My orders were to land on the coast of Cuba, seize Santiago, and march on Havana.
The troop movement served a dual purpose, as military preparations and signals of political determination.
We loaded whole blood and 100 coffins onto the carrier Iwo Jima dockside in Panama and made sure that there was a good audience to see it. And then we sailed.
The military did not know that the Soviets had 9 tactical nuclear missiles in Cuba, which could have been used against American Marines. But Kennedy and his advisors did know that several of the Soviet ballistic missiles could be launched against the U.S.
We were fearful that in the face of an air attack, or in the face of a land invasion, a Cuban sergeant or a Soviet second lieutenant, under that tremendous pressure, without orders, would launch a warhead against one of the metropolitan areas, or several warheads. And in that event, millions of Americans would be killed. And no responsible U.S. president and no responsible U.S. Secretary of Defense would put his nation at risk under those circumstances if he could possibly avoid it.
But that morning, the crisis moved one step closer to a military confrontation. An American U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet surface-to-air missile. The pilot, Air Force Major Rudolph Anderson was killed. Kennedy was forced to respond.
Events were beginning to create their own pressure. And once one side moves to that kind of action, as they seem to have done by shooting down the U-2 with Major Anderson in it, things may get worse pretty fast. And the requirements of the military enterprise can become very strong and very compelling. So there didn't seem to be very much time.
Kennedy feared that the downing of the U-2, coming right after the tough new Soviet demands, meant that Moscow had deliberately fired the first shot in a superpower war. Kennedy did not know that the order to shoot had not come from Khrushchev. It was a Soviet unit acting independently, in fact, contrary to Khrushchev's orders.
I know with absolute certainty that Khrushchev gave our military this command. They were not to do anything which might provoke the Americans and make the crisis more acute.
The crisis was spiraling out of both leaders' control. 2 hours after the downing of Major Anderson, another U-2 ran into trouble, this one over the Soviet Union. The Pentagon War Room phoned the news to Roger Hilsman.
I was leaving the White House and passed Mac Bundy's office in the basement, and an aide grabbed me and said my office was on the phone. And the guy was talking to me, said, I've got a phone to you and I've got a phone to the War Room in the Pentagon. I can hear the pilot of a U-2 who is strayed from a mission over the North Pole gathering air samples, and he's over the Soviet Union. The MiGs are scrambling and he's screaming for help, and I can hear him. So I put the phone down and ran upstairs to the president, and he was in Mrs. Lincoln's office with the president of Mac Bundy. And I blurted out this news, and of course there was this terrible silence because everybody thought, oh my God, the Soviets are going to think that we've sent a reconnaissance plane in preparation for a preemptive strike. Maybe this is the war.
Well, coming on top of the shooting down of Major Anderson, it was just one more thing. We felt the fates were conspiring against us.
The U-2 made it back safely. But by the end of Black Saturday, the president and his advisors were exhausted and disheartened. Some thought that war was inevitable.
I remember leaving the White House at the end of that Saturday. It was a beautiful fall day. And thinking, that might well be the last sunset I saw.
Saturday evening, fearful that an uncontrollable military confrontation might be imminent, Kennedy sent his brother to meet Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin. Kennedy was willing to move toward Khrushchev's proposition. If the Soviets removed their missiles from Cuba, the United States would promise never to invade the island. Kennedy also instructed his brother to give Dobrynin a secret assurance.
And the president authorized Bobby to convey to the Soviet Union through Dobrynin, but in total confidence, the fact that the president had decided long ago to remove our missiles from Turkey, that we could not do it now publicly at the point of a gun. That would undermine the alliance, but that they had his assurance that those missiles in Turkey would be removed.
In offering Khrushchev a carrot, Kennedy also brandished a stick. If the Soviets would not agree to his deal within 48 hours, or if another U.S. plane were shot down, the United States would go ahead with its plans to invade Cuba. And secretly, in these dark hours, Kennedy began to formulate a fallback plan, a public exchange of the missiles in Turkey for the missiles in Cuba, even though it might have disastrous effects on the alliance.
I'm having dinner with the president when Bobby returned. And all the news is bad. I continue to eat nervously while the two brothers are discussing this terrible situation. And finally they had finished, and I continued to eat nervously, unaware that the conversation had stopped. And then I heard that great voice, the president said, "Dave, you are eating the chicken and drinking the wine like it is your last supper." And I looked up embarrassed and said, Mr. President, after listening to you and Bobby, I'm not so sure it isn't.